recorded live.
Okay.
Okay, Omar. I'm sorry. Would you start again? I didn't hit the button in time.
That's fine. My name is Omar. I basically worked in the securities industry, particularly for a widely held fixed investment trust, and I'll go into detail of that right now. Back in 2006, I was involved in a terrible, terrible incident, and it basically woke me up and showed to me that I was mortal for the most part. Afterwards, I called different places, different home business opportunities, different places, tried things like prepaid legal and so on. And what ended up happening was I eventually ended up getting a publication called Scoopified. I don't know how they found my address, but they did. And I read something from a group called America's Bulletin, UCC1 Redemption. And I was doing research even then. Later on, back in 2007, being a broke college student, I went to a place called the Learning Annex. I think I used my last 20 or 40, 50 bucks. It was purely sales, and I met Donald Trump and a whole bunch of other different people, and I met a man by the name of Bob. And Bob became one of my most important people I've ever known. He was one of my mentors, so to speak. Of all my mentors, I have 4. 3 of them are lawyers. Anyway, what also ended up happening was I actually did an internship back with him in May 2007 till about August. I was basically their slave for about 13 weeks, and I learned a lot of things about real estate and mortgages. I also worked with a credit attorney as well, and the credit attorney I worked with taught me the secret of the credit industry. I'm just going to say it right here, right now. Debtors and creditors. Look up the definition of this in Black's Law Dictionary First Edition. You'll be surprised what you find. But here's the little thing. When it comes to debts, there is no debt, only the evidence of debt. In other words, the bankers violated general accounting principles. When my lawyer friend taught this to me, I was like, what? Are you serious? He says, no, Omar, you don't get it. The bank should be actually paying you. I'm like, what? I don't understand. This is crazy. He says, Omar, the people don't know their rights. They're too damn stupid. And he says, really, you should start reading the law. Read the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Read the Fair Debt Collections Practices Act. And so I did, and he told me to read the law. He even suggested at one time that I should be a lawyer. But I went on to do other things, and I've been doing research ever since then, trying to figure out how this entire thing worked. I was obsessed. And what I found completely blew me away. And I listened to different seminars and different guys and so on. I don't go around buying materials, but I do read and do my own research. One of the things I later on did research on is basically what we call a corporation, and I also ran my own real estate business as well for 2 years. During that time, I also participated in the acquisition of foreclosures. That meant I went after families and all that stuff. I don't do it anymore because my conscience could not handle it. I just couldn't do it. I also participated in conference calls much like this one for bulk bank portfolios. Some of these include REOs, where they take bulk real amounts of possessed property that's repossessed and sell it for 30 cents on the dollar. And they typically are registered in what we call tapes. They can be sold anywhere from about $10 million to $30 million to even $60 million. But the problem was I failed in that business as well because I kept dealing with all these seller mandates that had tapes that were sold over and over and over and over again with nonsense daisy chains. And it became a huge waste of time. Don't waste your time on those things because if you ever go on them on the internet, you'll be wasting your time. Anyway, I later on contacted a man by the name of Ralph Fisher and told him about my discoveries and findings. Some of you might have heard me on the talk show call last week with Sam Davis. Talking about the widely held fixed investment trust and that it is a person. The thing that people have to understand is that that is not really a very big deal. And I will tell you why. When you were born and you had your birth certificate merely serves as what we call warehouse receipt, evidence of the particular measure that has happened. Now, back in the old days of financing, they typically would take warehouse receipts and pledge them as collateral. This was typically done by farmers in the past. And I already talked about bankers' acceptances and trade acceptances and so on. Because what happens is when you sign for an application of a promissory note, you actually are doing what we call a banker's acceptance, where the bank is accepting your draft for the most part, actually your promissory note. But when a bill is accepted, then what ends up happening is it becomes a promissory note. And obviously, if you guys have ever read Modern Money Mechanics, page 7, where they basically state that they lent you Euro money for a promissory note, that's exactly what it refers to. Now, there's also been a lot of misinformation out there. When you have a pledge of stock, the United States acts as what we call a trust certificate holder. If you were to look up the definition of trust certificate note or trust certificate bond, you will eventually find that what happens is that a corporation is pledging other subsidiary corporations as collateral for all their debts. But here's the thing that many people are not understanding. On your birth certificate, it ends up being property of the state for the most part. And as you know, that is a separate corporate fiction. But if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, you have 8-digit number there. And sometimes on the left-hand corner, you'll see CPA. But here's the trick. With that particular number, that is a bond serial number. Now, most people have been going around claiming, well, you have a bond. You do not have a bond at all. And what happens is bonds are actually pledged onto your share of stock of the United States of America. It becomes your liability. That's why when you have the Constitution, the people became constitutors of the debt of the United States. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail of all that. With some of the people that have widely held fixed investment trusts, like the ones that I worked for, the private ones typically cap at about $25 million. Now, I learned about the different yields that are obtained through stocks and bonds and annuities and royalties, as well as other widely held fixed investments. These investments are fixed because you get what you call a yield, a fixed income. Of course, sometimes it will also be known as a rate of return for the most part. Remember that this income is typically fixed for the most part and will rarely, if ever, fluctuate. But what actually ends up happening is that we've had some investors put in money in this fund, and they would get 16% per annum. And that would mean they would get a rate of return of 16% in a year. One of the members that actually worked for our company, where I was an employee, actually was able to get $1 million into the company. They got a $10,000 commission, 2%, as a matter of fact. Plus, the hedge fund manager who I worked with would get a 1% management fee. Just imagine 1% of $25 million. And then imagine that 1% of $25 million multiplied by one-fold, two-fold, threefold. For each of these different funds acts as a pool and does a widely held fixed investment trust. The yield that this investor obtained was $160,000 every year. He would be paid $40,000 every 3 months for the most part. No bank will ever give that to you. Now, what happens typically with your widely held fixed investment trust, the sneaky trick about that is that your person is that trust, but what ends up really happening is that it's registered in what we call a street name. And under the street name, your share of stock of the United States is not registered under your name. It's actually registered under your broker. The broker acts as a trustee. And when you have the broker act as a trustee, they typically have certain responsibilities. As a matter of fact, I will read you a particular article from a financial publication. This is from Grant Thornton, as a matter of fact. I pause. Background of the funds.
I'm sorry, you got skipped out a little bit. You said Grant Thornton, and then what?
Background of the funds.
Background of the what?
Of the funds.
Funds, okay, thank you.
That's correct. Now, what happens here, it says here, in general, the asset-backed, mortgage, and unit investment trust industries have foreign funds that fix pools of mortgages, debt instruments, equities, or other financial instruments. To avoid an entity-level tax, the fund must be classified as a trust for tax purposes and not as an association taxable as a corporation. The trust document you guys typically fill out is the 1040. That's actually a trust agreement, and you can go into Christian Walter's calls where he talks all about that stuff. Trust classification causes the fund to fall under the grantor trust rules, which in general terms mean the trust is effectively ignored, and the certificate holders are recognized as the owners of the assets held in the fund. That's you. This treatment has caused many headaches for tax reporting purposes, since the beneficial owners of the trust must report income based on the timing of receipts by the fund, not the timing of distributions made to them by the fund. In other words, the trustee is viewed as an agent collecting income and principal payments and paying expenses on the certificate holder's behalf, while the funds that hold mortgages and other asset-backed securities are also subject to the rules. They are not addressed here. Now, I've also...
Omar, let me ask you, what are you reading from? Is that one of the attachments that we have?
I believe it is, yes. I believe it is one of the attachments. This is actually U.S. Treasury Department issues final regulations for a widely held fixed investment trust.
Okay. The pages are up and they're live, so anyone that wants to download what he's reading from, there's 2 pages. Check it out. It's on the privateaudio.homestead.com website. Okay, go ahead, Omar. Let's continue.
Now, when you have a bond, that's really nothing more than debt. Your stock actually merely acts as equity. And all of these particular instruments, debt instruments and securities, all have what you call a CUSIP number. I would highly suggest that you do not use the CUSIP number. Seriously, because what happens is that is actually property of the American Banking Association, and you can be accused of trademark infringement. I mean, I can get into other things about redemption and all that stuff, but I choose not to today, for the most part. And when you have this kind of fixed income, you have multiple bonds pledged by the municipalities, the corporations, as well as what's the other group? Well, municipalities would be treated the same as states. It would be the federal government for the most part. And when they're pledged, they typically have what you call a maturity period. T-bills is typically 1 year. T-notes is usually 5 years. And as well as T-bonds, that can go anywhere for about 10 years or more for the most part. And what also happens with all these things is they also have what you call coupon payments. These are the interest payments that are typically paid by from the bondholders to the paying agent. Now, in my original email that I discussed with you, Angela, my original thought was that U.S. Bank actually was the place that actually issued bonds, and I was actually quite incorrect. You see, this is how bonds actually really work. This is something Winston Churchill many people don't really get. When you have a bond and it is issued by the municipalities. When it is issued, it is actually sold at the same time and pledged into your share of stock of the United States. You don't actually have a bond. They're merely pledged into your subsidiary corporation, or what you would call your straw man. Now, if you were to call U.S. Bank, right, which is also known as U.S. Bank Corporate Trust Services, by the way, quick side note, they were started back in 1929. Now, I'm not suggesting that people try to go and write their own bonds, because you don't have the standing to write your own bonds, and they have to actually be cleared for the DTC. The DTC is actually your broker, and they're the ones that are actually holding your dividends. When you have your dividends, they are derived from the share of the profits from what the broker has already made, typically. Just like if you were to have what you call yield premium, yield spread somewhat, between your mortgage broker and who they sell the note to, for the most part. Because what ends up happening with that is, in most cases, when you're doing a banker's acceptance, it ends up actually becoming what we call an obligation. in which you actually bonded yourself, and unless you rebut that obligation, you're pretty much screwed. And I'll get into civil rights and why they're your primary defense and stuff later. Now, when you're talking about the DTC, they are actually the holder of 99.9% of all U.S. securities, all of them, and I mean all of them. They actually also serve as the warehouse as well. Now, this also kind of relates to the 1099 OIDs. You see, there's only two reasons you ever do them. 1099 OIDs, original issue discount, does not apply to you because you are not a bond holder. Bonds are merely issued. People have to understand that they are merely used as transmitting utilities, and that the government 9 times out of 10 will usually be right. And that's because they were the ones that created it. There will be issues where you're dealing with contract law and trust law. Now, the trust law is that there would be a grantor trust, and you'll be both grantor and beneficiary. And obviously the trustee would be the DTC. But then there's the contract law, which always predominates for the maximum law states. For he who begs for something knows exactly what he is asking for. That's why you'll see a lot of your documents say application. Because what happens is the lending party has an intellectual property copyright that puts them in the dominant position for the most part. You're literally tricked. Now, when you're talking about these different bonds and all these other different things, what you guys have actually issued are what we call debentures, if you're using a bondsman, but you can typically consider them promissory notes and promissory notes for the most part. Now, the problem that people have failed to understand is most people have talked about there being a so-called exemption, so to speak. But an exemption is nothing more than a tax credit off of your net income, so to speak. And if people had read the actual Social Security Trust Fund reports, they would know that there's nothing really held of real value in the Social Security Trust Fund. They're nothing more than non-negotiable special U.S. government securities. Now, if you ever look at your Social Security card, you'll notice that the serial number on the front the serial number on the back will be in red. You'll also notice that the front will also be in red. Now, older Social Security cards also used to say the U.S. Department of the Treasury, but many people believe that they are issued by the IMF. And I can also give you a link to the IMF reports that basically states that the payments themselves are indicative of what the government wants to spend. Because what happens is you have the Social Security Trust payments. Now, these Social Security Trust payments are typically derived from the taxes that you pay every year when you work, for the most part. And what happens is the excess Social Security Trust payments, for the most part, go straight to the Treasury General Fund. And any excess Social Security payments go straight into the TT&L accounts, which we do not have. We do not have TT&L accounts. They're only held by commercial banks. I've actually called them. And I have the actual Treasury publication that states that as well. There's an actual particular CFR, but I won't get into that now. What happens with that is those excess payments are actually sent to the commercial banks to be held as reserves. Did everybody get that? Reserves. So that the banks can make more loans, for the most part. And if you read into the Social Security report for 2007, you'll see that the way that they fund is through the collection of tax receipts. They actually tell you how the government raises its money through business operations. As a matter of fact, if you were to go into the Department of the Treasury website, you would look up legal tender status, and it talks about U.S. notes right here. What makes this so funny is that I recently emailed the Federal Reserve for a Freedom of Information Act request, and they claim they don't use the back of those numbers. But here's the funny trick. They don't, and they're actually telling the truth. But here's the little thing that many people have failed to understand. I'm going to read you a little paragraph. Congress has specified that a Federal Reserve Bank must hold collateral in equal value to the Federal Reserve notes that the bank receives. This collateral is chiefly gold certificates and United States securities. Now, notice they state United States securities. These are not the same United States securities that are held in the Social Security Trust Fund. And also don't forget that according to Title 31, there's only 300 or so U.S. notes available. And as Thomas Jefferson once said, a dollar note is actually as good as a dollar bond for the most part. So each one of the Treasury Reserve, each one of the banks of the Federal Reserve would have about $25 million in U.S. bonds, securitizing their interest in the amount of U.S. notes that are held in circulation. Because what happens is the banks act as depositories of public money. Now, there was one guy who claimed that people were trustees of public money. And this is absolutely, positively not true. We're not trustees of anything. We've lost that right back in 33. I mean, there's a bunch of other different laws and stuff that I can get into. Now, as I continue to read this, this provides for the note issue. The idea was that if Congress dissolved the Federal Reserve System, the United States would take over the notes, liability, and obviously would meet the requirements of 12 U.S.C. Section 411, but the government would also take over the assets, which would be of equal value. Federal Reserve notes represent a first lien all assets of the Federal Reserve based on the collateral specifically held against them. Now, it is mathematically impossible to pledge $300-something million in U.S. notes against the number of citizens that we have. So, therefore, this exemption that you guys would all be talking about would be about a $650,000 promissory note that is pledged onto the Social Security Trust Fund. This is primarily backed by the United States notes held in collateral, which is why the first letter will be that of a U.S. bank. That is their interest. And I highly suggest that you not use those numbers on the back of your card. And if you were to also look within your birth certificate, you will find that those numbers are held by what we call municipal securities information repositories. Repeat, municipal securities information repositories. And as you do more research on this, you will eventually find that those bond serial numbers are used for the municipal bonds that are issued by your state and local municipalities within your area. And they're used to build all sorts of projects. I mean, sewages, buildings, everything. I mean everything. It truly is an amazing, amazing system, because basically the entire banking system really is backed by the full faith and credit of the people on which they are bound into a Ponzi scheme. In order for the system to keep running, they have to collect revenues through the Social Security payments and then pay out certain payouts. But the problem is they have to get more and more people into the system. By getting more and more people into the system, they're able to make more and more Federal Reserve notes. And if you were to ever look into the creditors of the United States thing that I sent you in the email earlier, you will find that anyone who makes a claim against the United States government is in violation of that law. And that also, excuse me, with that particular law, we are the creditors of the United States, but you always will always lack standing just due to the fact that it was them who created it. You will always end up in the weaker position because it was their intellectual property. I mean, if you were to go through any of these processes, you would have to ask yourself the following things. Number one, do you have the standing? In other words, did you put up some sort of pledge? Number two, were you signatory to the original contracts that were created to allow people to do these things? Number three, did you create any of these things? No, you did not. And number four, if there was a trust relationship, who were the parties involved? Who was the grantor, the trustee, the beneficiary? Now, in some cases, some people may have even gone to other banks and tried to sue people for fraud. But the number one reason they lose is because they don't understand that our primary recourse, notice I say primary, is based on the Roman civil law. And when you're dealing with Roman civil law, pretty much everything is really a tort issue for the most part. In other words, what tort did they violate? What civil wrong did they do in order to cause you injury or harm for the most part? And was it intentional or not? Typically, an intentional tort would be fraud. And in cases for banking issues, it would be fraud by misrepresentation. But that is very hard to prove because you have to go beyond the preponderance of the evidence and beyond a reasonable doubt to prove that. You would not only have to rebut and deny your signature, you would have to find the proper witnesses to be able to show that they violate general accounting principles. You would have to pay an accountant. You would have to go get an insurance auditor. You would have to go and get a contract person who specializes in knowing what the words in a contract mean. And that can be very time-consuming and takes a lot of money. But if you were to ever look into provisions like the Fair Credit Reporting Act or the Fair Debt Collections Practices Act, you would see that none of those things have anything to really do with any alleged debt, so to speak. None of them do. They have to do with certain things that they must follow. That's why 90% of most of the mortgages you see out there are typically fraudulent because of TILA and RESPA violations. As a matter of fact, I know of one particular gentleman who's actually forced under hush-hush, who actually had the bank pay him $100,000 and was able to keep his house free and clear because there was a signature in the HUD document that did not belong there. That's a TILA and RESPA violation. But I hope that by now you guys have a pretty good enough overview of what a Wiley Health Fixed Investment Trust is. Basically, there's a trustee and there's a middleman. In that case, from that thing that I particularly read, the broker or trustee would be the depository trust company. They are the holder of 99.9% of securities for the most part. And one of the agencies that they work with is another group called SIFMA. That's www.sifma.org. And with them, they have a IRS department that determines certain rules. They've also had a dividend division that also took care of how they were going to do the WIPID rules for the most part. That's why the honest services fraud issue that Ralph Fisher may have talked about is a weak argument at best because there would have to have been a civil right that was violated, something that they told them that they were supposed to do for the most part. You have to that's the main thing you should really look at for the most part. What civil law did they violate? Was there a trespass? Those kind of things. Also, one of the things you should also learn about are derivatives. And some of these derivatives include some of the things that are sold in bulk packages for the bond market all the time. REOs, real estate owned, as I mentioned earlier. NPNs, non-performing notes. Those are the notes that are in default. CDS, credit default swaps. MTNs, medium-term notes. CDOs, collateralized debt obligations. This is typically your credit card debt, and it is sold all the time. All the time. Now, also when it comes to these different things and all these different instruments and stuff, and the bonds I talked to you about earlier, if what you guys were running were bonds, then you would have basically paid U.S. Bank to be your paid agent, and they would have issued what we call coupon payments, and the coupons are typically attached to the actual bond itself, and it's sent over electronically to the proper bondholders who buy up the debt for the most part. And I think with that, I've given you all a real mouthful about trade acceptances, bankers acceptances. I chose to cut off a lot of things for the most part, unless you guys want me to get into the Social Security Trust Fund and how the Old Age Survivors Fund and Disability Insurance Fund works. Anybody? Angela?
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you, so is it a good thing to have a WIFIT or what?
It's not, the secret is that the WIFIT is you. All it's stating is that you have dividends that are being produced.
Okay, so how would
The government doesn't
go
have to give them to you. They have the intellectual property right. However, when you guys do a tax return, remember the basis of accounting that I talked to you about. It's called double entry accounting. In order for an account to be debited or any account to be credited, another account must be debited. They can't create money out of nowhere, because if they used Federal Reserve notes and tried to create Federal Reserve bonds for Social Security, the entire system would have catapulted on itself almost immediately. That's why the U.S., the special government securities, are pledged on the U.S. bonds that the Federal Reserve Bank holds. Because one of the things you'll eventually find is that the Treasury writes checks, the IRS acts as an accountant, and the IMF just acts as a watchman over all the other different accountants for the most part. That's what really happens. That's what it's basically telling you. They don't have to necessarily give people these particular dividends. But your warehouse receipt would be your birth certificate that you guys already have, and it would be held with the DTC. It never really leaves the warehouse, because when you really get down to it, the Social Security system acts as what we call an indemnity contract. Indemnity contract will also be known as an insurance contract. This was the only way that the bankers could really be able to legally bound the people for the most part. The only way that they could legally do it. They had to get the people into an insurance policy scheme where they were planning on giving people a benefit privilege. This is one of the reasons that the government was even planning on expanding Social Security age to age 75 for the most part, because that's someone else that they don't have to pay. Because remember, this particular security produces dividends every year. As a matter of fact, in accordance to page 12 of the 2006 report, the OADIS Trust Fund, which is the Old Age Survivors and Disability Insurance Fund, which is managed by the Bureau of Public Debt. This is the same group that many of you guys talked about that are involved with Treasury direct accounts for the most part, which you do not have. Your account that you guys talk about would actually be a securities account with the DTC. And the IRS pretty much acts as the blockade man deciding how they're going to do certain things. It's a very well done trick, because for the most part, you're forced to literally sign a tax return to be able to access those dividends. You fall under what is called a recursive obligation, where you're bound to something without your consent. It sucks, but that's the way the system works for the most part. That's why if you were to read into different publications of Consumer Protection Acts, you'll see the term natural person, individual, natural person, individual, natural person. They're not like artificial persons, because artificial persons have what you call a BMF file. And when you write it with all dashes, I keep telling people over and over, there's no account. It's merely just a tax identification number. And there's a reason why that's important. You see, have any of you ever heard of the Buck Act? You would know that with the Buck Act, this was really one of the final straws. With that, there were 10 federal areas, as they call it. These 10 federal areas consisted of 10 Social Security districts, which are still in existence today. Notice you're only able to replace Social Security card within your lifetime only 10 times, if you notice. 10 times. But here's the little thing. These federal areas acted as the way that the government could obtain federal jurisdiction over you, because the first 3 numbers of Social Security card correspond to what we call an area number when you were born, for the most part. The other numbers correspond to a group number, and the last 4 numbers are a random serial number. That's why if you were to ever go into court and file a lawsuit against someone, they always ask you for the last 4 digits of your number. Those numbers bind you to the federal jurisdiction of the United States government. That's what really happens. And I'm going to also read something from what we call a privacy impact assessment. Privacy impact assessments are basically how the government stores information for the most part. You can find these on the irs.gov webpage, or do irs.gov and search for privacy impact assessments. Some of the ones I suggest you look at are PMF, Payer Master File, This is the same thing that you know about with the 1099 OIDs, because you're actually acting as the payer, and the other parties that are receiving money from you are the recipients for the most part. And obviously you will want to get their tax identification number. There's also the individual master file. That's you. Typically it will be 3 numbers, then 2 digits with a dash, then 4 other digits. Bop, bop. This is the same as your SSN number, or in some cases you may have what you call an I-10. Now I'm going to read you a little excerpt straight out of the report, and this has to do with the census as well. 1D, SSA numinant, number identification data, which is a complete history of changes, such as name changes. As reported by the issuer, the SSA account number. The SSA account number would be the number without dashes. But using it without dashes makes no difference, as I've told people before about Fisher, there's nothing of value in the account. In order for it to work, they have to have insurance payments get paid in. Just like when you pay insurance premiums and you pay them to, and they take your money and they pay them off to other corporations and politicians. Those are your monies that you're paying them, and they're going back into the hands of politicians. Happens all the time. Now, if more than one record exists, this is from the SSA numinant. This is a fact here, straight out of the government. The exists for a request. The earliest record will be displayed first. Now, you can order an SSA numinant file straight from the SSA Freedom Information Act request. But
hey, Omar?
Yes?
When you're saying SSA, what kind of?
Numinant. N-U-M-I-D-E-N-T.
Numinant.
That's right, and you can order this.
Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
You're very welcome. The last record will be returned for the latest. Now, typically, if you were to go and order it from there, it'll only have your name and the number of times that your Social Security card was replaced. Notice they record that for the most part. There have been some people who claimed, oh, you have 10 bonds at the Fed through the Social SSA. That's complete nonsense. It only has to do with the original 10 districts that were created, which were called 10 federal areas, which basically gives them federal jurisdiction over you. And you're bound onto it no matter what, every time you use it. That's why so many people who tried to argue the whole straw man argument, in which they are true for the most part, have lost because they have failed to recognize this key fact. Now, I'll continue with the rest of it. The last record returned will be the latest. This information includes taxpayer name, address, date of birth, place of birth, birth certificate number. This is the file number that's on your birth certificate. And what happens is if you will apply for a census job, there will be a front sheet that says Department of Homeland Security. And what happens is they typically want a picture ID. The number on your picture ID is actually your state identification number card. And it's automatically bound to both a Social Security number and your birth certificate. In the state that you were born in, you're required to have both for the most part. That's why in some cases, as Sam Davis once mentioned, they always ask for your Social Security card because it's nothing more than an indemnity pledge in which the American people bound themselves to be debtors as well as creditors of the United States debt for the most part, thus acting as transmitting utilities under the UCC. Date of birth, place of birth, birth certificate number, place of birth, date of birth indicator, sex, race, citizenship type. By the way, quick side note, nationals, the so-called state citizens, aliens, and regular U.S. citizens are actually all treated the same because for nationality, you are presumed to belong to a nation by either birth or naturalization. Unless you can state that you were born of a different nation thereof, you are presumed to belong to them no matter what. And civil rights would be your primary recourse. But at least then you can get paid, because that's what civil law is all about when you really look this stuff up. Disability freeze indicator. It's right there, folks, and this is under the microfilm replacement system, the MRS, privacy impact assessment. straight out of the IRS website. And when it comes to the 1099 OID, if you call the actual U.S. bank, ironically, they actually tell you how to do it. And you're going to have two things listed there, principal payments and bondholder. Now, why do I like the word principal payments, you may ask? And what does bondholder have to do with it? Well, as I mentioned earlier about a zero-coupon bond, you do not have a zero-coupon bond. A zero-coupon bond is nothing more than a bond, which is debt, that basically pays no interest. It is discounted at a discount. That's why when you have things called negotiable instruments, like your promissory notes and bills of exchange, you will find that they are called negotiable because they are discounted, sold for a discount, and the bank is typically already paid. Now, the reason I like the word principal payments is because some people have been calling themselves authorized representatives. But if you were the authorized representative, you would be merely an agent. How can you be an agent of something and authorize someone else to be an agent? You would basically have authorized yourself. That is impossible. No matter how much you try to escape it, you are the principal. You are bound and responsible for everything that fiction does. And they can bind you under the laws of admiralty. Actually, there's special provisions of that talking about the Black Book of Admiralty. Jerry Kane is actually probably one of the most correct when it comes to a lot of these other different things for the most part, and the most accurate. We are under Roman civil law. We are under the debt money system of the Baal. This is all correct. And remember that they were the ones that created the system. Then I'm going to get into one little word called the word sovereign. When it comes to the word sovereign, you have to understand there are two adaptations. One is the adjective form, and the other is the noun. Notice it speaks of king or ruler. Remember that you did not create the government. And under constitutional law, the people are subjects, basically listen to their sovereign and obey their sovereign's rules. We are not necessarily sovereign, but we could go and create our own governments if we wanted to, for the most part. This as long as we don't interfere in other people's commerce, for the most part. And I'm trying to help bind all of these different things together. Like, remember, when it comes to CUSA numbers being pledged to securities, they are property of the American Bankers Association, for the most part. And they are issued to the securities, but the issuer will be the state, or that local municipality, or that local corporation. Because if you go to CUSIP.com, you will find they have both a corporate division and a municipal securities division, for the most part. And then remember, when it comes to the IRS, they are there to basically do their job. They're merely reading forms, for the most part. And then you have to remember the whole thing about your person that produces dividends, because there's multiple bonds that are pledged against your share of stock and bought and sold and traded over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. However, technically, if you were to try to find out how much that really was, that can typically almost be seen almost as a constitutional violation for trying to dispute the debt of the United States and therefore mark you as an insurrectionist. Now, when I talked about acceptances not too long ago, I also talked about trade acceptances. We have a trade acceptance. Once again, the acceptor merely does a promise to pay. That's really what an acceptance was. And in the old days where people used to do acceptances, for the most part, they typically would have a payment order. Let's say they needed some financing to go and pay off their bill with their vendor, because there would be a vendor-vendee relationship. Let's say they needed something like that. What would actually happen during that time with acceptance financing is that there would be acceptance, a date, not always your signature for the most part, and a typical payment order like payable to bear on demand or immediate credit payment that I heard from William Deal not too long ago. Now, if you were to go in the Federal Reserve Act and read about bankers and trade acceptances, you'll see everything that I'm talking to you about, especially with the bankers acceptance in which the bank is once again acting as the acceptor. They can't monetize any of your instruments or anything without your signature. Your signature really is a fungible instrument. Also, some of the things I talked about the honest services fraud and how the U.S. cards were actually started by J.P. Morgan, as a matter of fact, and that under honest services fraud, once again, it would only work if there was a civil right that they violated for the most part, because remember, they were the ones that created it. They do not have to pay us dividends if they don't want to. Also, about the whole banking thing being fraud and all that other stuff, one of the things that my mentor once told me is, despite you learning all these other different things, it's typically easier to pay them for the most part because all the expert testimony that I talked about earlier. I know I seem to be probably putting in a lot of information. I did write a long outline going back to the emails that I sent and stuff. I actually edited out a whole lot of other things. I don't consider myself to be an expert at all, but I've worked in the industry, and one of the main things you have to understand is that if you read that Grant Fortune article that I just talked to you about, it basically all comes together, that your security is not registered under your name. It's registered under a street name. Because if it was registered under your name, they would be making payments to you by now. If the people were going around writing bonds, they would have to have agreements with the DTC. There's a special document for that, as well as U.S. Bank. And they would be paying U.S. Bank to be their paying agent. And the paying agent would be the one who would make payments to the bond holders, what we call coupon payments. Also, there would be a transfer agent as well to change the name of the security, as well as a trustee relationship with typically the trustee could be U.S. Bank, or it can be the DTC or some other securities firm thereof. The trustee would typically hold what we call an indenture agreement for the most part. And when you really go and look through all this, like when I called SIFMA, the Bureau of Public Debt, the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, the TTNL place, I actually found more about them too. When it comes to commercial banks, they have what you call an EFPT account for the IRS, in which the Treasury will collect their payments for their taxes for the most part. As you dig and dig through this, you'll eventually find that all the securities firms, there's about 800 of them that are public, I worked for a private one, are all members of the DTC and also members of SIFMA. You can look them up on www.sifma, that's SIFMA.org for the most part. And they have regulations and rules that they determine every single year. The exemption would be nothing more than a tax credit, because what happens is, since you were the creator of that note for that application, they would owe you that in the form of a tax credit, as Phil once talked about in one of his previous calls. He's right on the money, and I hope one day that I get to speak to him, because I have a lot of questions to ask him for the most part. I have questions to ask about some of Ralph Fisher's methods, because I think I may be familiar with what you guys are doing for the most part. But I beg of you to not use the QSIP number. Don't write drafts using the number on the bottom of your birth certificate, because that is a municipal securities repository information number, and you will be locked up for trademark infringement and violation of Chapter 17 violations. As I told you about the Social Security number, that binds into the federal territory. Certain numbers, if you look up area numbers, Social Security area numbers, you will find it matches the area where you were born, all of these different districts. You're bound to them with that particular number, because that number truly is a government identification number, though the government will try to deny it. Colin Powell himself has even said it as well. Anyway, I really do hope that I finally helped done my part, debunked a lot of myths, talked about fixed income security, Social Security, how it's really nothing more than an insurance policy which binds you with the full faith and credit clause for the people for the most part. How corporations raise money. Typically, they either sell shares or they pledge bonds onto other corporations for the most part, pledging debt and then selling it simultaneously. That's how they're all issued. How our with it is not really a big deal. It's just basically saying that our corporate fiction goes out and produces dividends every year, and that anytime you would go and do what we call trust receipts, or cash receipts as they call it, when you're sending out these receipts, the trustee is merely reimbursing you for the Federal Reserve notes that you originally purchased for all the items you bought. They're merely just reimbursing you. Now, I will be doing one myself for the first time this year, very soon. But I want to make sure I get certain things right about trade acceptance.
Do what? Do what?
A possible 1099 OID, but I won't discuss that in incredible detail. But I gave you basically the basics of why it actually works for the most part.
Well, yeah, it seems like the only way to access what you've got coming back.
Yes, because you're forced into paying Federal Reserve notes for the most part, and it doesn't really matter it kind of matters and it kind of doesn't matter, because under that law that I talked to you about, where I showed you in the email about creditors of the United States, that's a Title 18 violation, and anyone who tries to make a demand on any dividend or any kind of money will be put into 5 years in prison or more. And
well, what about those of us that are doing accepted for value?
Well, that's the whole special thing about the acceptances. It's a trade acceptance. Your trade acceptance is merely another way of sending over the receipts for the parties to pay for your expenses. That's all you've been doing all this time. You just didn't realize it. At the end, all those transactions were clear for the DTC for the most part, but the IRS can typically act as a middleman, but it's all DTC. And you'll never really be able to completely access it because they were the ones that helped create the system. And if you look up the DTC, you will eventually find that they are a part of the Federal Reserve Bank. And as I mentioned in the paper earlier about legal tender, the United States, for the most part, Federal Reserve, they have a first lien over everything, not the Treasury. The Treasury is just merely there to write checks. And what happens is if everyone started using U.S. notes, there would be a bond that would be called. And these bonds would be the United States bonds that each of the Federal Reserve banks hold. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of provisions with the use of United States notes under Title 12. Some of them include in which the banks are not even allowed to use U.S. notes at all for collateral of debts. It's illegal. And if they do that, they probably will be they will be severely punished, and they will be dealt with very harshly. They will go to prison probably for the rest of their life, for the most part. And that's really the way the rules went, because if everyone started using them, then eventually the whole system would collapse. That's why, if you want to look up more about WIFID, I highly suggest you look up the WIFID accounting method. I'm not sure if this is a 26 CFR or not, but you should do WIFID 43.424, cash receipts. That's exactly how you do it. That's exactly what you guys are doing when you do your 1099 OIDs and stuff, for the most part. Now, maybe they may make some changes to the rules a little later, but that's up to SIFMA, the DTC, and the IRS. All three of these organizations co-collaborate together. And if you were to look up 12 CFR 701.37, you'll find everything you need to know about Treasury tax and loan accounts. I actually called their department and stuff, by the way.
Can you repeat that again?
Absolutely. 12 CFR 701.37.
Thank you. You talk awfully fast. I'm going to have to listen to this over and over again, I'm sure, to get it all. But go ahead. It's really entertaining and interesting, I tell you. You're really good. You haven't stopped for a minute, and I love it.
Thanks.
I'm absorbing all of it. I'm sure as everyone else are.
Thanks. That means a lot. Because what happens is, remember what I kept telling people, civil rights are your basic primary remedy. Now, criminal court is a different issue, but for the most part, that's your primary remedy. I'll even read some UCC codes very quickly. UCC 3-105, the maker of the notice to grantor. That's one. Negotiable paper, as I mentioned to you earlier, I'm just reading a definition because I have about 6 or 8 books that I handwrite. I handwrite all this stuff, and I've been doing research over this for probably the last 3 years and more. It's been my obsession, so to speak. Some people have even said, you should work for the government, or maybe you should. I don't think so. I mean, typically, you guys can even start your own hedge funds. and start buying up your own paper and stuff or whatever. But it would be a headache. You would have to go through a ton of SEC paperwork because they're like white on rice. You got legal agreements. You got to pay a $10,000 operating agreement. That's going to be about 80 pages. You're talking $50,000 and up. And I'm going to give you a definition of negotiable paper. This term is applied to bills of exchange and promissory notes, which are assignable by endorsement or delivery. I would highly suggest that you go into Unterdraw right here. And when you go into Unterdraw, I highly suggest you read about what we call an allowance under Article 14 and Article 72. An allowance is another name for a bill of exchange. That's exactly what it is. And then if you go and look up even more stuff, you will eventually find information about what they call transfer. When you have something of a promissory note that is transferred, as I talked about before, there would be a banker's acceptance stamp. Now, the whole Yusef thing I was talking about, or MERS number, I wasn't sure if I mentioned MERS number or MINS. But for the most part, it's actually MERS for the most part. It's typically 13 digits. But once again, that number doesn't really matter because it's not your property. And I have a very strong belief, and it is true, that you should respect intellectual property. And that's why so many people who've done this are now in jail. There's nothing typically wrong with an acceptance. Remember, it's called a trade acceptance. Trade acceptance. You have to know the difference between a trade acceptance and a banker's acceptance. Another example of a banker's acceptance is typically where someone has what we call a bill of exchange. And what will happen is the bank will be acting as drawee for the most part. This is typically used through letters of credit for the most part. Typically, the letter of credit will be written upon specific conditions for the most part between the vendor and the vendee, depending on what you guys are trying to do. But I want to know about these tax forms that you guys are doing, William Deal's methods, and all these other different things. I mean, I was going to get into a little bit of information about maritime liens, but I chose to not go there for the most part. But if you can understand the basics of your security, it's a share stock, it's a corporation. The reason there's the trust relationship is because you end up becoming what we call a beneficial owner of your own security, and it is owned by your broker. The broker is actually the DTC, period, no matter what. And that your primary remedy typically rises out of two things, torts or what we call breach of contract. And I'll give you the definition of tort. An action arising from a violation of a duty, a civil wrong, just as I mentioned to you guys earlier, or injury not involving a contract that is committed upon another person or property. A personal lawsuit is a tort action. That's what Roman civil law and these statutes and stuff are all about. That's what it's all about. And if you want to learn more about warehouse certificates, I would highly suggest you look at UCC 7202, UCC 7209, lien of warehouse, UCC 7104, Title 12, Section 83, banks cannot loan on its own stock. So where the heck do they get the money from? They get it from you. I would highly suggest you also look at UCC 8113, in which the statutes of frauds are not applicable for securities. In other words, their asses are covered. UCC 8114, evidentiary rules concerning certificated securities. But remember that obviously your birth certificate would be nothing more than a warehouse receipt. Always remember that. You'll never have the original security, and any claim that you would make on that would be counterfeit. But in the old days, as I talked about with farmers, warehouse receipts used to be, pledged for collateral, typically for the storage of goods. UCC 8201, this will talk to you about issuers. UCC 8115, securities intermediaries and others not liable to adverse claimant. Now, if you listen to adverse claimant, there was also a thing about a non-adverse party that Ralph Fisher also mentioned. It relates to that for the most part. Title 12, Section 90, banks as depositors of public money. And typically, the only ones that can demand public money, there was another provision I was trying to look for. Those who are depositors of public money typically would be the banks, but you can only get it if you were paying it out of a salary or trying to get it out of a bank account. They make those restrictions on purpose for the most part, and they really are done on purpose. Some civil rights things you may want to look at, and this is one of the number one things that's done with the Fair Credit Reporting Act. 1681S-2A3. That's something you may want to also take a really nice look at for the most part. That's the duty of the particular furnisher to basically provide a notice of dispute. But keep reading through that. I don't have time to go completely into that, but I did state in our call that I will only be available for about an hour and a half. Once again, I'll read the definition of paying agents. The institution responsible for handling payment of principal and interest as registered and bearer bonds. Bearer bonds have not been circulated since the 1980s. The paying agent is also responsible for reporting certain income tax information. If you go into the U.S. Bank website, you will find exactly 3 tax forms. 1099-B for the broker, 1099-DIV for dividend payments, not dividend, that's not there. 1099 OID for the original issue discount for the zero coupon bond that was purchased by the bondholder. They pay taxes on it even if income wasn't produced. And they buy it at a discount hoping that the present value of that bond will be much higher and then they'll get more bang for their buck. And they usually do, especially in these kinds of times in the market. It's why China ends up having so much of a lien hold interest right now, because you have to understand the difference between creditors and equity holders. Bondholders who are equity holders buy the debt in order to finance government operations. They have the first and primary position. Discount bond, now you'll know what OID means. A bond purchase at an amount significantly less than the value of the face of the bond. Most common issues are zero coupon bonds. Generally, discount bonds accumulate interest through the life of the bond, paying both principal and original purchase price at accumulated interest and maturity. This interest, once again, would be coupon payments. Bond contract, that's an indemnity agreement. Actually, it's not an indemnity agreement. It would be what we call an indenture contract. And people don't have the standing to write their own indenture contracts. All these instruments that you guys write from all these different guys are nothing more than debentures and promissory notes. I haven't found a single document or law that states that people have the standing to write their own bonds. Because if you did, you would be issuing them to bondholders, and they would be expecting either a discount or having coupon payments. It's just promissory notes for the most part. Anyway, I know I went through a lot.
We have some questions lined up.
Sure.
Would you like to take some questions?
Sure, I can take a few questions.
All righty. Our first one here is Rolls 58. Been waiting a long time. Go ahead. Unmute your phone. Rolls 58. Are you still there? Maybe we lost him. All right. Put your hand up again if you come back on, and I'll take you next. Right now we've got California. Go ahead, California. California. Unmute your phone if you've got it muted on your end. Oh, hello. We can almost hear you, California. Say something.
I can't hear anyone.
I can. Well, I hear noises. Oh, he just muted himself back out. California, did you have something to say? Hello. Okay.
Trust me, this was just a condensed version. If I went into much more detail, we'd be here for 3 hours.
I know. Okay, hold on. We've got South Dakota. Go ahead, South Dakota.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Go ahead.
So, are the promissory notes that we write, are they? Do we have the right to write them or not?
Actually, that's straight out of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Read bankers' acceptances and trade acceptances and look up the word individuals, and you'll see where your standing lies there. All they've really done is a banker's acceptance. They discounted it for the most part. You fall under what we call a recursive obligation. There was a story that I listened to for Agenda 21 Talk, and what happened was this guy actually wrote a note, but he had to go through certain certification procedures. For example, when one gets a notary for anything, they merely act as a third-party witness. They certify affidavits. They certify depositions because obviously they would sign as that witness. But anytime you're doing any of these things, you would always want to get a certification stamp. This is also known as an apostille. And these apostilles also counter the Hague Convention because there was a special provision in the Hague Convention that makes these things international documents for the most part. But the problem with some people when they're doing some of their affidavits is that if they miss one little thing, then it's completely wrong. Plus, even when you go and do a promissory note, you still have to go through stamp certifications for the most part. And I just don't feel like going through that kind of headache. I just do a trade acceptance and send it out. I sent over a few to the IRS not too long ago, and I'm basically waiting for a response.
So what's the difference between a bank acceptance and a trade acceptance?
Once again, the acceptor is a bank, and you were actually involved in them the moment you applied for your promissory note, because your note is the application, and when you get the security, it should have the banker's stamp right in the center, pop, with their name and signature. As a matter of fact, I called the lender not too long ago and asked them, and they said yes, it does. That's why the security you typically get is counterfeit. But the problem is when you're rebutting that obligation, you have to understand that it's done through what we call fraud by misrepresentation, and that's very hard to prove. And there are 5 specific things that are relate to that. Plus, you will have to get expert witnesses on top of that. And there is a guy who's actually helped people do the promissory notes by the name of T.J. Morris, and the banks have accepted them. I believe he sells his course for about $2,000 or so, but he's a mortgage guy. I'm a hedge fund guy. We both worked in the real estate industry for the most part. I was trained by a hedge fund manager. I've seen the ugly side of it because we would lend hard money loans at about 19% interest, 2% to go to commissions, as I mentioned earlier, plus 1% would go into the management fee for the most part. That's what actually happens. That's what these pools of funds do. They get their investors the best rate dividends that they possibly can, higher than you would with any bank. And hedge funds are the only real banks left because they actually have a debit and a credit. And every single month, they have to, for the most part, have an accounting statement. And this is one of the reasons that Bernie Madoff got so much trouble, because his accounting statements were fraudulent. Does that answer your question, South Dakota?
Yes, it does. And I was just wondering, do you feel that the IRS is the place to send the accept for values or the DTC?
For now, I would probably try the IRS. But for others, if they're brave enough, they may try to send it to the DTC. But regardless, the DTC is mainly acting as your broker. They own 99% of all securities. This was confirmed to me when I called SIFMA myself. There's a lot of other details that I had in that conversation as well that I'm not going to really get into because there was a confidentiality clause, and I will respect that for the most part. I mean, ideally, you would use the QSIP number as well for your actual security, but your security is just a stock. It's just a subsidiary corporation. It has bonds that are pledged onto it. You do not have a bond. I get really irritated by that nonsense. You do not have a bond. You have bonds that are pledged onto you. You are merely used as a transmitting utility. I mean, Lord knows how much your stock is really worth, but it's worth a lot of money. And the government doesn't have to give you those dividends because when William talked about possession being 9/10 of the law, they created it. It is their intellectual property. And they will own 90% of it for the most part. So let's say your share stock was $100 million, and it had $50 million in debt attached to it. Just like when Ralph Fisher talked on Common Law Method, he spoke to a person named Reese about this and how there would be corporate bonds also written on that particular shares of your stock as well. When that would happen, your share stock would be worth about $50 million. Imagine 1% of $50 million. All those dividends that are just sitting there. That's exactly what they give you when you go and file a tax return. Because it's double entry accounting. There's no way they can create money out of thin air. In order for an account to be debited, another account must be credited. Period. No ifs, ands, or buts about it.
Does T.J. Morris have a website?
He's actually on Tim Turner's site, as a matter of fact.
As a link is on that, or what would that be?
He has specific calls, but you can search for him. He does the Living Free and Clear system.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. Okay, we have another call on Central New Jersey. Hello.
Yes, hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, this is Jan from Jersey. I have a couple of questions.
Shoot.
And, okay, firstly, do you have an email address that you'd like to provide anyone or everyone? Or
Not everyone, because if I do that, I'll be getting emails all over the place. Talk to Angela, and she'll send me any other specific information.
Okay.
For the most part. Go ahead.
Okay.
That's fine. I'll be glad to do that.
Thank you, Angela. And I wanted to ask you about Yusef. You did briefly mention, and I didn't quite catch it. Is it not recommended to get it? In order?
I wouldn't recommend it because, once again, there's that trademark infringement issue. It is property of the American Bankers Association. Of course, a law is only as good as it is enforced, but I highly suggest to not do that. I also talk about there are provisions I wanted to get into about the UCC ones and why it's actually a fraudulent claim. It's a counterfeit claim. It is a warehouse receipt. That's the main thing you have to remember. You'll never get your original security. I also have a UCC, an SEC article that I read not too long ago that specifically states that the shares never leave the warehouse. But I could be wrong, but it states it right there, and these SEC reports.
Okay, now here's the thing. I heard, and I'd like you to substantiate this, that there is a form that the Treasury has that you could request that lists, and I was hoping to do that through my QSIP number on my quote-unquote
List of what? List of what? I'd like to hear more about this.
No. Well, I heard that there is a form that you can fill out, you can complete, requesting all the trading that has gone on your Social Security and or your birth certificate. And you can look back on all the trading that's been going on, because I personally would like to find a way to see what securities, what promissory notes, what money orders have been tendered. And I'm trying to figure out a way to do this. And I thought, since you can't enter your birth certificate number or your Social Security number to do that, that you need a QSIP number to do that. So that's why pardon?
Yeah, you would. The thing is, once again, a law is only as good as it's enforced. Like, I think that if someone was just using it to probably obtain information, that it really wouldn't have much of a problem. But there was one particular group called QSIP numbers at hushmail.com, I believe, on Christian Walter's website. I wanted to get their information because I refuse to do business with anyone unless they give me tax identification number. I won't do that. But if they're willing to cooperate and give me a tax identification number, then I'll be more willing to do it, because what people have to understand is 9 times out of 10, you need a license to be able to charge people money. I've known that for years, but the person who helped reinforce that to me was a woman by the name of Mary Elizabeth Croft. She wrote a book about how I clobbered every agency, blah, 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 blah. I've been in contact with her as well. for the most part.
You don't know the form. Sorry.
My initial plan was to actually go through U.S. Bank, and I've been in contact with them for the most part because I had a lot of questions to ask them as well. They are actually the parties that are responsible for the paying agent work. They merely act as a middleman. If you were to read their report in 2007, they specifically state that they act as middlemen between bondholders and issuers in their reports, and I spoke with them. And the issuers of bonds typically can be developers, they can be regular municipalities, or they can be federal government, because the issuer number will be the property of the state for the most part, and the states are actually bound to what we call the federal territory, and the federal territory is indicative of the 10 Federal Reserve, the 10 areas that were created under the Buck Act, which were indicative of the Social Security Act as well.
So you don't know anything about this form at the Treasury Department. I have to do more research, but I understand that is an excellent way to apply your CUSIP number because if you want
you would actually have two, as a matter of fact. One would be for the useless United States security bond, in which the government may decide to pay you your Social Security benefits. They can default on that. And the other would be for your actual corporate stock, as evidenced with the Municipal Securities Information Repository number that is used for municipal bonds. Now you know what that number means.
Okay, fine. So you don't know about the form at the Treasury Department. And for that reason,
that's why I wanted to basically know exactly what you were talking about, because I even stated that I don't even know every single thing, but I worked in the Securities Department. I've seen UCC ones. I've seen mortgage security agreements. I made copies of these agreements. I was trained by a hedge fund manager, and I did a lot of these other things. I participated in the purchase of these bulk packages that I talked about earlier.
Well, do you have recommendations on how you can determine what is being traded on your particular securities? I want to know who's trading what and when and where. So what can I fill out? Who can I go to? Who can I talk with?
I would highly suggest you talk with U.S. Bank, like what I'm doing, as a matter of fact. They're actually supposed to be getting back to me Tuesday. The thing is, your security is never traded. They merely pledge bonds onto your security. You're the collateral, whether you like it or not. And the indemnity bond for the Social Security number is the final act of that security, which secures you under the full faith and credit of the United States government, based on the ability to tax you. If you read the municipal securities reports, you'll actually see that. That's what happens for the most part.
Any particular person at U.S. Bank? Who are you talking with?
I won't get into those particular names because I don't want to end up getting into too much speculation for the most part.
How about what department?
That's good, Angela. What's a good department?
I would highly suggest that you probably start with the customer services department and just ask them questions. Be friendly for the most part, and they'll be more than willing to basically help. Remember that you have bonds that are purely pledged, but there is another way. Are you familiar with a 4506T?
Yeah, but that doesn't tell you all the trading going on with your securities. It merely tells you everything that's been going on with the IRS and some of the stuff that's been offset on IRS, 1040 stuff. It's just not as complete as the one at the Treasury.
That's right, but because you have to remember that you're merely the beneficial interest holder of your particular share of stock. That's the main thing you have to remember. You're purely have a beneficial interest. It is registered in the name of your broker. If you call any of these places, they'll even tell you that your stock is either registered or is held in the name of your broker. Your broker is the DTC, and all the other member firms are subsidiary corporations of the DTC, also known as the DTCC. That's what it all comes back to. Now, because of their copyright issues and all that stuff, they technically don't even have to let you know. But I would like to know more about this particular Treasury form. because I like to also speak about this kind of thing to help debunk a lot of the nonsense and to help learn as well.
Well, here's the thing. Here's the scoop. If we can produce something that can show that these things are being cashed in or traded or
they're not cashed in, they're pledged. And what happens?
They're pledged and they get units for them or something, right? They get some equivalent currency.
No, it's the same currency, because what happens is when they pledge on these different bonds for the issuer and the clearinghouse, it will be a clearinghouse operation. They are pledged and sold simultaneously to a bondholder who becomes the creditor. And they collect interest on those things through coupon payments, and U.S. Bank is the place that actually issues those payments for the most part.
Would you like to